let us maybe start and with the presentation of Niels.
Regarding the subject of this presentation, I see in the program that the formal heading is human uncertainties relevant to the safety associated with radioactive waste management and rolling stewardship. And although my presentation will touch upon this subject, it's I wouldn't say it's the main subject. The presentation is based on a working paper that was disseminated a couple of months ago that deals with I would say rolling stewardship in a more basic and fundamental way, and perhaps also tries to introduce some sort of a European perspective to this notion. Next slide, please, Julian. So the content of the presentation would be to try to describe a definition of the notion of rolling stewardship, and possibly in more than one version. Also to give examples of its role in current national, European, and international law. To reflect on the role of civil society in rolling stewardship and to weigh its pros and cons. And finally, perhaps to reflect on a possible way forward, not least in regard to EURAD and human. These projects that the Nuclear Transparency Watch currently are involved in. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to give very much of a definition of rolling stewardship. I think Gordon is much more capable and qualified to do that later in this program. But perhaps I should mention that broadly speaking, rolling stewardship signifies an intergenerational management concept which requires monitoring and maintenance of radioactive waste for an indefinite period of time, with responsibility being passed on from one generation to the next, and also preserving the possibility of retrieval, recharacterization, and repackaging of the radioactive waste. Next slide, please. Also here I refer to some of Gordon's former presentations, so I will leave that to him, obviously, to continue with this. And also regarding the next slide, I would say the same. Next slide, please. Slide number 6. However, I think it would be of interest to take note that one could argue that the basis of rolling stewardship would be something called long-term stewardship, which is basically a notion introduced by not least the US Department of Energy, and it's necessitated by the more than 140 sites in the US that are heavily contaminated by radioactive substances. If you look at the map, you can see the geographical dissemination of these polluted sites. Next slide, please. All these sites are part of the legacy of the nuclear weapons production during the Manhattan Project and the Cold War, and they're still dangerous to the public health and the environment, and therefore require management into an indefinite future. In this context, the US Department of Energy has introduced a definition of a long-term stewardship, which is also a legal definition. And it is the physical and institutional controls and other mechanisms needed to ensure protection of people and the environment at sites where plans have been developed to complete cleanup after site closure. For instance, landfill closures, remedial actions, removal actions, and facility stabilization. This includes land use controls, monitoring, maintenance, and information management. Next slide, please. Also interesting, in my opinion, would be to try to introduce strong and weak versions of a rolling stewardship, not least in regards to its relationship with long-term stewardship, because an obvious question would be, where does long-term stewardship in fact end and rolling stewardship begins? Whether long-term stewardship could be considered as a weak version of rolling stewardship could be a question of terminology, but obviously it's first and foremost a question of delineation of the two concepts. Apart from the fact that long-term stewardship focuses on radioactive contamination and rolling stewardship mainly relates to geological disposal of radioactive waste, in fact, there appears to be more similarities than differences between the two. Next slide, please. So I have tried to make a small table listing some parameters that could determine the difference between weak and strong versions of rolling stewardship. Obviously, those are only some of the parameters that might be relevant. So if I will just go through it very quickly. Regarding the time horizon, weak versions of long-term stewardship and rolling stewardship could span a few human generations, whereas strong versions could be bordering on the interminable. Concerning the scope of rolling stewardship, a weak version would zero in on final disposal of radioactive waste, whereas a strong version could encompass final disposal of all highly toxic, long-lived waste, transcending the sphere of radioactive waste management. A weak version regarding the startup of rolling stewardship could begin after closure of a deep geological repository, while preserving the possibility of retrieval, recharacterization, and repacking of the waste. A strong version could begin before and after closure of the deep geological repository, in the latter case ensuring that the repository is not sealed off. The difference between the strong and the weak version would then be that a strong version ensures easier access to retrieval of the radioactive waste. A strong version of rolling stewardship could also proceed even without a deep geological disposal as an interminable version of an intermediary radioactive waste storage facility. If rolling stewardship, for instance, begins before the post-closure phase of the final disposal, it could encompass all phases of radioactive waste management. For instance, policy, framework, and program establishment, site evaluation and site selection, site characterization, facility construction, and the facility operation and closure. In a weak version, rolling stewardship could be reactive, for instance, focus on mitigation of already existing radioactive contamination and not in its character be any different from long-term stewardship, or it could be preventative in regard to disposal of radioactive waste in order to see that leakage of radioactive substances into the environment is not going to happen. Regarding continuity, it could be broken due to deficiencies in a weak version of its institutional framework, which could result in stop-and-go policies for the radioactive waste management. Or it could be unbroken if suitable institutional mechanisms are in place. This would also depend on the normativity manifesting itself as proper legislation that in a strong version would make these mechanisms mandatory and in a weak version voluntary. Also regarding safety, which is probably very important in this context, in a weak version, rolling stewardship would not be considered part of the safeguards that protect the integrity of the final disposal of the radioactive waste. But in a strong version, obviously they would. Also, in a strong version, there would be a wide range of stakeholders that would be involved in the radioactive waste management decision-making process. And those would include operators, regulators, WMOs, technical support organizations, research entities, and not least the civil society. In a weak version, there would be no or little stakeholder involvement. Also, in a weak version, transparency and public participation would be based on the so-called DAT concept, deciding, announcing, and defending decisions of the radioactive waste management by the authorities. We know best, decide things for ourselves, inform about them no more than we have to, and defend our decisions with all available means. In a strong version, there would be well-established institutional mechanisms in place to ensure that transparency and public participation is guaranteed. Finally, in a strong version, proper funding for final disposal would be accumulated at the same time as the radioactive waste from the nuclear power plants is generated, whereas in a weak version, funding would be provided by subsequent human generations. Also, in regard to terminology, rolling stewardship would not be semantically much different from a long-term stewardship in a weak version, whereas it would be different in a strong version. Next slide, please. So, if we look at how the legal implementation of rolling stewardship has taken place, it must be said that there's very little implementation of any strong version of rolling stewardship in current national, European, and international law. However, there is an example from the United States. By some people, rolling stewardship, if it's perceived as a succession of stewards tending to needs from one generation to another, the so-called US Department of Energy's site transition framework has been seen as a step in the direction of rolling stewardship, because this framework identifies documents that should be passed to new site owners or stewards. However, the framework only ensures that a document is passed, not that it contains what it is supposed to contain, or that the relevant underlying information is available and accessible. Next slide, please. However, if we look at long-term stewardship, especially in regard to US national law and parts of European law, It's a complete different situation. In the US, on a site-specific basis, management of any associated long-term stewardship is conducted in accordance with orders from the Department of Energy and its guidance, federal, state, and local environmental and resource protection laws, and agreements between the Department of Energy and the US state and federal environmental regulators. You also find long-term stewardship in European law, mainly within the European Union, because it is necessary because of the many uranium mine and mill tailing sites, which are found in at least 12 of the European member states. Subsequent European Commission reports have concluded that there's a need for an effective set of measures for coordinated institutional control of the uranium mine and mine tailing sites, which only long-term stewardship can provide. Next slide, please. Also, there's a very interesting paper from the European Commission staff from 2011 that in fact recommends long-term measures and institutional mechanisms which can in a way be perceived as a version of rolling stewardship. It calls for programs that integrate all measures under existing European community and national legislation and take on board all closely interrelated managerial, social, economic, and technical aspects during the radioactive waste management decision-making process. This effective stewardship, which is described in the paper, must take into account continuing changes to social, technical, and economic conditions and processes, such as changing stakeholders, perceptions of risk, science and technology, social structures, governmental systems, economic circumstances, and priorities. It also touches on the subject of knowledge preservation as an essential precondition for a successful stewardship program. Next slide, please. And I found a quotation from the paper, which perhaps is particularly relevant because it also outlines the prospects for this introduction of rolling stewardship into European law. The paper is expected to facilitate the discussion on the long-term regulatory and management approaches to uranium mining and milling waste in the context of the overall policy on radioactive waste management as an integrated part of sustainable development of the nuclear fuels cycle. It will form a basis for the NSREC group to develop a common understanding and, if appropriate, suggest a common approach to establishing long-term stewardship programs. And I mean, if you accept the argument that this version of long-term stewardship is related to rolling stewardship, it actually introduces some very interesting prospects for the future in regarding to a campaign to promote rolling stewardship in a European context. Next slide, please. Obviously, what is interesting to us as representatives everybody, some of us, of civil society. It's the role of civil society in rolling stewardship. And if you look beyond rolling stewardship, the role of civil society in radioactive waste management has been recognized in international, European, and national law for a long time. Obviously, the question in regard to rolling stewardship, how should it be defined in this context? And here I think without giving a long lecture, I think that it should be noted that a European framework already exists that could be relevant to rolling stewardship. And it's mainly based on the Aarhus Convention and the Radioactive Waste Directive from 2011, which has a very relevant article on transparency. But I mean, there's a whole lot of regulations and directives that could be relevant. Also, a nuclear transparency watch has given a description of best practices for interaction with civil society and transparency and public participation in their so-called BEPA report from 2015. This report outlines or describes 4 pillars for effective transparency: effective access to information and communication, effective access to public participation and consultation, effective access to justice and decision-making, and effective accesses to resources. And it also establishes a whole level system for evaluation of efficient transparency, which in my opinion could also be relevant to how rolling stewardship is perceived. Next slide, please. So in some circles, as we know, rolling stewardship is, if not a controversial, then at least somewhat contested notion. And it would, of course, be interesting to see what are the arguments for and against. And it could be argued that the main argument in support on rolling stewardship would be a strong emphasis on safety under all conditions as the main goal of radioactive waste management and final disposal of radioactive waste, which should not be diminished, offset, or compromised. And if you stress this argument, you could actually say that rolling stewardship is the best manifestation of the precautionary principle, which is in fact also a legal principle and one of the main pillars of European environmental law. Also, as an intergenerational management concept dealing with uncertainty, rolling stewardship sets out to define what we could call an intergenerational common good in order to address the uncertainties triggered by the extremely long time horizons of the issues that it deals with. And in addition to be a very prominent manifestation of the precautionary principle, it also is a very good manifestation of the so-called responsibility principle and intergenerational justice. I will go to the next slide, please. Also, I think the arguments against rolling stewardship are well known. The main argument would probably be its perceived lack of practicability, because some people doubt whether it can be sustained for tens or even hundreds of thousands of years. Also, due to its high economic costs, it could be argued that it puts undue and disproportional burdens on future generations, and in doing so violates the so-called polluter pays principles, also one of the main pillars of environmental law. Rolling stewardship also raises some fundamental questions regarding the long-standing discussion on whether obligations to future generations in fact exist, and if so, how far they go, and also whether a comparative, egalitarian, or absolute standard should be applied, and how risks and uncertainties should be dealt with. I mean, these are to some extent also rather philosophical questions, which do not only relate to rolling stewardship. Next slide, please. So and obviously this is very difficult, and there could be many conclusions drawn from these arguments for and against the rolling stewardship. But one synthesis, if you will, could be that objections to rolling stewardship could be refuted with reference to the principle of responsibility in combination with the recourse to the precautionary principle. It would be sort of difficult to refute the arguments on impracticability and undue burdens put on future generations, because that would also depend on how the rolling stewardship is actually implemented in practical terms. However, whether its high economic costs are proportional to the safety level that it achieves will also depend on the dependability of the passive defense mechanisms of a final repository, and also on the potential economic and environmental costs if they fail. And that we don't know anything about either. On all circumstances, strong versions of rolling stewardship are generally not compatible with the polluter pays principle, because the generations that have generated the radioactive waste will in fact not pay for the mechanisms that deal with the waste. And also a conclusion could be that any position on the viability of rolling stewardship would depend on the preference for weak or strong sustainability. I won't elaborate on this right now. So to sum up, what could be a possible way forward if we want to promote the rolling stewardship? And in my opinion, it would be important to stress that the rolling stewardship is not a controversial or alternative notion. You will already find it in US environmental law, and or at least you find long-term stewardship, which is a very related concept, and you could argue in some to some degree, and in some respects, a weak version of rolling stewardship. You already find that in US national law and in European law. So it's not alternative, and it's not controversial. It's actually mainstream, at least in some regards. Secondly, I think it could be demonstrated that it is a dynamic concept that could manifest itself in more than one version. It's not a one-size-fits-all concept, in my opinion. And these parameters, which I tried to describe, would suggest that there are actually many versions, and that could actually be implemented in a very site-specific way. Also, even as supporters and protagonists of rolling stewardship, I think we should be open to discuss its pros and cons without the prejudice. And fourth, we could perhaps demonstrate how closely it is linked with the long-term stewardship, which, as mentioned, has already been mentioned in a legal framework. And if we try to introduce rolling stewardship into the, for instance, EURAD or human research framework, we should perhaps also try to introduce long-term stewardship because it appears that it already have the interest of the European Commission. So by promoting research on long-term stewardship, in fact, we could also increase the interest for rolling stewardship. And I think I have already mentioned the sixth and final point, to try to integrate research on rolling stewardship in the EURAD project, perhaps by way of the human. And that would be my presentation, I think. Thank you.
So the floor is yours.
Thank you.
You have your own slides, or shall you request the support of some of our colleagues?
Well, with regard to, I do have some slides that aren't necessarily as illuminating as they might be, but I'd just like to say a few things. With regard to governance, I certainly agree with you. This independence is very important. Here in Canada, we have none. The Natural Resources of Canada Department is a department who is charged with the responsibility of promoting nuclear power, uranium mining, sales overseas, et cetera, and also radioactive waste. And that's the same department to which the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission reports. And we in Canada, in the NGO community, feel that this is a serious problem. The International Atomic Energy Agency team visited Canada a couple of years ago, and one of their recommendations was that Canada should develop a more detailed and respectable radioactive waste policy, and for the first time formulate a national strategy for radioactive waste. And over the last year, 2021, there have been many briefs submitted to NRCan, Natural Resources Canada, urging that there be an independent agency set up, an independent agency of waste management and decommissioning, and that this should be a priority. We now have, just in January of 2022, a draft policy put out by NRCan, Natural Resources, which completely leaves this out. So they want to keep things just as they are, with NRCan in the driver's seat, and that means the nuclear industry in the driver's seat of the radioactive waste. NWMO, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, which is currently searching for a willing host community for a deep geological disposal site, is owned by the waste producers. And so we have, and they interact with the communities. They give millions of dollars to isolated communities. Some of these isolated communities have no more than 1,000 residents. Mm-hmm. And year after year, they give them money. They've been interacting with some of these communities for more than 10 years. And last year, I made a presentation to one of these communities, and the members of the committee that were hearing my presentation, it was the first time they'd heard anybody but the industry presenting to them. And I discovered that they had never heard of iodine, radioactive iodine. They'd never heard of radioactive cesium. I'm thinking of iodine 129. I'm thinking of cesium-137, of course. They had never heard of these materials that are contained in the radioactive waste. All they knew was that these bundles are the waste. And I had to try to wrap my head around the idea that they, despite 10 years of interaction with monthly meetings with the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, they still don't know what these wastes are. I find that shocking. And I think that if we had an independent agency, they would have made greater efforts to communicate what the nature of the problem is, because the fuel bundles are not really the waste, they are the containers of the waste. The waste are all of the hundreds of elements inside those containers. And just as you can have a glass bottle that gets cracked and lets materials out escaping from the glass bottle, so you can have a damaged fuel bundle which allows materials to escape from inside the fuel bundle and find their way to the surface. So I just think that there's such a fundamental misrepresentation of what the problem is. Of course, the citizens in these communities, if they feel that the fuel bundles are the waste, then they say, well, surely if you bury those fuel bundles in rock underground, they're not going to come back. They don't realize the fuel bundles are just the containers. And there's many different, in fact, dozens and hundreds of radioactive materials, each of them having their own different pathways through the environment and pathways through the human body. So this is a problem. Now, with regard to rolling stewardship, I believe that one of the main reasons why rolling stewardship seemed like an attractive idea is because, first of all, it's what you might end up with anyway, whether you like it or not. For example, we had a previous problem of a town called Port Hope, Ontario. Port Hope is one of the major producers of uranium hexafluoride for export. Canada has been one of the major producers and exporters of uranium for a long time. And Port Hope has been a major hub of producing radioactive materials. Well, there has been a lot of radioactive waste that were in the early days dumped into the harbor, dumped into ravines, open ravines around town, quite deep and beautiful actually, and used in construction, used to build schools and homes and so on, which are radon generating materials and consequently dangerous. Now there's a major municipal cleanup underway at Port Hope, costing $1.2 billion to simply consolidate all this waste and put it in a gigantic mound a little bit north of town, less than 3 kilometers from Lake Ontario. And this giant mound is intended to be good for 500 years. Time will tell. But there's a backstory here which I would like to refer to, and that is that previously they had decided, and I'm going back to 1975, they had decided that these wastes were in fact a real problem. They had to be removed from the town, and that the area was unsuitable for permanent disposal of radioactive waste materials. Therefore, they should seek for a home in Ontario, somewhere else, which had better geology to put these wastes in. So they spent 8 years, a federal agency called the Siting Task Force, spent 8 years looking for a willing host community in Ontario. And after 8 years, they came up empty-handed. They came up with no communities. And as a result, this mound that is being built at Port Hope is actually not a solution, but you might call it a booby prize. It's in lieu of a solution, this is what they're doing. And they don't even say it's a final disposal. They say it's temporary, but temporary for a long time. The waste materials we're talking about have half-lives that make them dangerous for many thousands of years, way beyond the lifetime of the mound. Well, that might happen with the high-level waste too. In Canada, we're now looking for a high-level waste site. It is narrowed down to 2 communities. It's quite possible that they could come up empty-handed again. And so the situation is that when you come up empty-handed, you end up with rolling stewardship anyway. You might say that with regard to the Acid 2 salt mine, they've had to take that material out of the mine, but where is it then going to go? they don't have a destination for it at the present time. So, and when we talk about the WIP project, for example, that was mentioned earlier, the WIPP project, that was not high-level waste. That was low and intermediate level waste, primarily plutonium contaminated waste. And in fact, low and intermediate level wastes are a problem that is seldom mentioned and seldom really discussed as to the nature of it, because there's very large volumes of waste from refurbishment, from decommissioning, and so on, all of which also has to be looked after for very long periods of time. They have activation products, for example, nickel isotopes, which have a 76,000 year half-life. Chlorine 36 has a 300,000 year half-life. Carbon 14 has a 5,000 year, almost 6,000 year half-life, and so on. So these things are also very long-lived radioactive waste as well. They're not nearly as concentrated as the high-level waste, but they also have to be dealt with. And so having an independent waste management organization, we feel, would be a big step forward, because you could have independent expertise drawn not only from the nuclear industry and the nuclear regulator, both of whom have a vested interest in trying to say, oh yeah, we've got this problem solved. And that message that we have this problem solved, even though they haven't even broken ground on a DGR, that message has been so strongly put out in Canada that now when they talk about a whole new generation of nuclear reactors called small modular nuclear reactors, they already have talked about building one in Ontario, which is going to be a boiling water reactor, two in New Brunswick, which is molten salt and liquid sodium cooled, one at Chalk River in Ontario, which is going to be a high temperature gas reactor. And guess what? In promoting these new reactors, there is simply no mention of radioactive waste at all. So not only is there no mention of the high level waste, or if it does come up, they don't talk about it. If it does come up, they say, oh, yeah, we've got that problem solved. So it's a way of blinding ourselves to the nature of the problems that we're creating. And of course, they're not even talking about the really what they're going to do with the dismantling of these reactors when they're finished. So I feel that the rolling stewardship and an independent agency would be a big step forward, because it would help society to understand what we're dealing with, to understand the problems they are, and to give a chance for civil society to become involved. Because there is going to come a day when the nuclear industry is not going to be around, and this becomes a societal problem. All these wastes, including the uranium tailings. In Canada, we have something like 220 million tons of uranium tailings, all of which are in surface facilities, and which, as you know, the uranium mine tailings are radioactive with the natural decay products of uranium. 85% of the radioactivity in the ore ends up in the tailings, but it's a sand-like material, and it can easily be used and has been used for construction of buildings, for making cement. It's very tempting, in fact, because it looks like harmless material. And this is a real problem which has not really properly been dealt with in Canada either. Now, the CNSC has taken steps to improve the management of uranium tailings that are currently being produced, although there's still a huge mess from past efforts in Uranium City and elsewhere. But they are not touching the problem of radioactive, other radioactive mining wastes, which are being used for home construction in Montreal, in the North Shore of Montreal, in Oka, in Varennes, in St. John, and so on. So there is a real problem here of underestimating the problem of radioactive waste by thinking that the nuclear people are so smart, they're going to solve the problem and we'll never have to think about it. And the same thing goes for our politicians. They never think about nuclear power. Recently, we had a set of hearings on nuclear waste governance in a House of Commons standing committee. And even the nuclear industry people who came to testify spent more time talking about the wonders of nuclear power as an energy source, the small modular reactors, the medical isotopes, the electricity that it produces, the fact that it's not carbon emitting. And most of them said virtually nothing about radioactive waste, even though that was the subject of the hearing. So we do have a problem here of involving civil society. We have a problem of independence, which is a big time problem in Canada. And I do believe that rolling stewardship will play a role in helping to solve those problems. Maybe I could just quickly go through some of the slides that I prepared, which are not, as I say, I think that Niels has done a good job in laying out some very important things, but I'll share my slides just to see what we've got there. Can I, do I have the ability to share my slides? I don't think so. Okay, can you see that all right?
Very well, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll just go through these slides. We got started in Canada with the World War II atomic bomb program. In 1943, there was the Quebec Accord signed in Quebec City between our Prime Minister and Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt for the three nations to cooperate in producing the world's first atomic bombs. The military links were that Canada was asked to supply uranium for the US and UK war effort. And the only really available source of uranium that was not in German hands was recovered from the residues of 1930s radium mining up in the northern parts of Canada, the Great Bear Lake. And so we supplied uranium from that mine and from Port Hope, Ontario, where the refinery was, to the Manhattan Project. Later on, when they discovered the uranium stockpile from the Congo, we used that material to supply uranium. This is what I call the Yellow Cake Road. This is from a map that Bob and I made on our Macintosh computers. And it shows the pathway of uranium from all the uranium mines in Canada, all funneling through Port Hope, Ontario, and going out abroad. 85% of our uranium is exported, and only about 15% is used domestically. And this chart shows the various mill sites and what the uranium was used for. A lot of them were used for bombs. Up until 1965, virtually the whole production of uranium in Canada, which was very voluminous, went into the bomb program and building up the thousands, tens of thousands of nuclear weapons in the US arsenal. The hex barrels are the hexafluoride for enrichment. That's the way our stuff is exported. And the other one, the fuel bundles, are for the CANDU reactors domestically. We also had a plutonium connection because because of the Quebec Accord, we had atomic scientists from the UK, France, and Canada working in Montreal on the best techniques for producing and separating plutonium. And that led to the building of Canada's first research reactor, which was fueled, moderated by heavy water, and therefore an excellent producer of plutonium. And as everybody knows, the plutonium is created by, I've come to use the word impregnation. If the uranium-238 atoms are impregnated with neutrons, then we get plutonium and the other transuranics, which of course are major contributors to the long-term risks for high-level waste. This is the size of a photo by Bob, the exact size of the plutonium ball that was used as a nuclear explosive in the Nagasaki bomb. And of course, those are also used as triggers in the H bombs. So Canadian uranium played a big role in building up the huge arsenal of weapons that existed there. Then came Atoms for Peace. And Canada, of course, well, we had that very unfortunate situation where India exploded its first atomic bomb using a Canadian reactor. So they used the plutonium from a Canadian reactor, which we gave as a gift to India, which was a copy of the first full-scale NRX research reactor at Chalk River. Now, the interesting thing is that for the first 30 years of the nuclear age, even though high-level waste was being produced all the time, nobody knew outside of the nuclear establishment that there was radioactive waste from nuclear reactors. nuclear waste was something that was simply not discussed or acknowledged. It wasn't until, in fact, 1977 that the first federal government report called Managing Canada's Nuclear Waste came out and advocated a deep geological repository. But that was 30 years after we had already been producing this high-level waste. So at that point, we sort of had a problem, a sort of a shock of recognition that all of a sudden nuclear power is not so completely clean as we were told, that it does have these wastes. So Brian Flowers, around that time, 1976, wrote in his UK Royal Commission report, "We are agreed that it would be irresponsible and morally wrong to commit future generations to the consequences of fission power on a massive scale, unless it has been demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt that at least one method exists for the safe isolation of these wastes for the indefinite future." At that same time, the United States issued a report from Washington. The growth of nuclear power in the US is threatened by the problem of how to safely dispose of radioactive waste. Interesting the way it's put, it's the nuclear industry that's threatened, even more so than human life and the environment. So the important thing here is that if we don't solve this waste problem, the industry is in danger. Now, in Ontario, we had a Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning, which I participated in, and they came out in 1978 with a report saying that that unless this problem can be solved by, let's say, 1985, that there should be no more nuclear power plants built. A moratorium on nuclear power plants should be considered in Canada. So the way I look at it then, around the mid-1970s, mid to late 1970s, various governments, the UK, Canada, and the USA, recognized that the future of the nuclear industry depended on finding a safe solution for these wastes. This puts tremendous pressure on the industry because it means we have an existential problem. If we can't convince the politicians and the public and the regulator that we have solved this problem, then we may not be able to build any more reactors. And indeed, there have been no new large power reactors ordered in Canada from that day forward. All the reactors that are built and operating now were ordered no later than 1978. So, but now we have a government that is pushing very hard for new reactors in the form of so-called small modular reactors. Now, this is from California Energy Commission, which did a 3-year set of hearings on radioactive waste. And the last 2 paragraphs at the bottom there, excessive optimism about the potential for safe disposal of nuclear waste has caused the backers of nuclear power to ignore scientific evidence pointing to its pitfalls. That's the real crux of what we found, that you have to weigh scientific evidence against essentially engineering euphoria. I thought that was a nice turn of phrase, and I don't think it's just a piece of rhetoric. I think it's a fairly accurate reflection of the problems that critics of deep geological repositories have. This is the cover of the publication that came out of the Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning. They show the uranium fuel chain at the front cover, and then on the back cover, they had a gigantic question mark connected to the whole operation. In other words, what are we going to do with nuclear fuel waste, an unsolved problem? So the Porter Commission said that continuous monitoring of waste disposal research should be undertaken by an independent panel. Once again, the call for independence. Time and again, we've had independent groups looking at this problem, and they've all recommended an independent outside agency that's separate from the nuclear industry. We've never had that in Canada, and we don't have it today. If nuclear power should be reassessed, a moratorium on additional nuclear stations should be considered. If progress is not being made, say by 1985. Now, 1985 is a very short time, but the industry made it sound like it was a piece of cake. When asked about, as a matter of fact, I remember distinctly being on panels with nuclear people from the industry saying that nuclear waste is not a technical problem, it is a public relations problem. that quote unquote. And that was my first insight into how the nuclear industry regards the waste problem quite differently from how most of us regard it. Of course, a CANDU fuel bundle, these are the CANDU fuel bundles we have, and they become lethal after operation. They go from the wet storage. This is one of the unopened wet storage fuel bays, and then dry storage. And then we also built an underground research laboratory in Manitoba to actually do tests to try and see if we could verify, and that was the word they used, to verify the deep geological disposal option. So can geological storage solve the waste problem? Why not get rid of this waste safely by burying it all deep underground? Let's assume that nuclear fuel waste is moved to a distant location as rapidly as possible and buried as quickly as it can be. Will this solve the nuclear waste problem? Most people in Canada have been led to believe that this is a solution. And therefore, you can go ahead with nuclear power and build more reactors and so on. The following series of graphics explores the possibility in very simple diagrams. So the X indicates a nuclear reactor. The red dots represents the radioactive nuclear fuel waste after a year. And the point is that this waste builds up beside the reactor. As the years go by, more and more radioactive waste. Look at all that radioactive waste right beside the reactor. Shouldn't we get rid of it? Shouldn't we at least get it off the surface? The nuclear industry offers to solve the problem by burying the waste. So why does the industry want to bury the waste? Is it unsafe where it is? Well, the industry says, no, it's not unsafe. Will we stop making it? The industry says, no, we'll not stop making it. We'll just get a solution for it. So we feel that here's a fundamental problem with the geological disposal concept. If the premise is that you're doing the geological disposal to save the nuclear industry, and to allow you to have another nuclear renaissance with even more nuclear reactors than we had in the past, then you're not really solving the problem. Because here's how the picture looks with geological disposal. You take only the older portion to be buried, and then you use this as a justification for expanding the industry. So you get more reactors, but you notice that you have a significant amount of unburied radioactive waste there. Much more so than was in one reactor. In the core of one reactor, you only have 1 year's worth. Here you have like 30 years worth, perhaps, or 16 years worth, let's say, of irradiated fuel. That's an awful lot of material. And if you build more reactors, then you have a growing inventory of unburied radioactive waste at the surface, even with a fully functional geological disposal system, which buries the nuclear waste as rapidly as humanly possible. So in other words, this solution is incompatible with continued growth of the nuclear industry. And that's a message that the general public does not get at all. But that's a message which we feel is appropriate. The industry does not intend to stop making nuclear waste. In fact, they intend to ramp it up significantly. Nuclear waste cannot be shipped for at least 10 to 30 years. So the unburied nuclear waste builds up. And with more reactors, the stock of unburied waste keeps growing, even if the older, cooler waste is buried. So rolling stewardship has to do with certain words like management, the process of dealing with or caring for something. Can we manage nuclear waste safely for decades or centuries at a time? The answer is universally yes. The industry says yes. We say yes. Now, mind you, if you think it's only going to be temporarily on the surface, you might not provide as good containment as otherwise you might. But it is possible to have very robust containment. In fact, in the United States, they talk about HOSS, H-O-S-S, which is, oh gosh, I forget what it stands for now. It's on-site storage. It's a very reinforced on-site storage, which can resist a lot of natural forces and human-made forces. Disposal, one meaning of disposal is the process of throwing away or getting rid of something. Do we know how to get rid of nuclear waste? No. And that's the problem with using the word disposal. It communicates subliminally the idea that we can get rid of this stuff. We can't get rid of it. We're stuck with it. Abandon it. to cease to support or look after it, to desert. Is abandonment of nuclear waste ethical? Is it scientific? Well, our answer to that question is no, but the industry's answer is yes, that it is ethical to abandon it, and it is scientific to abandon it. We deny both of those premises. We think it's not true. And in fact, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission issues a license to abandon. So when they post-closure, they give a license to abandon, which means, okay, and what that means essentially is that it's no longer the industry's problem, it's your problem. But we're not going to give you the necessary tools, the necessary resources, the necessary information, the necessary instrumentation to actually manage this waste, but it's your legacy now. So, and one of the things that Bob so well illustrated in his graphic, these are Bob's drawings, is that abandonment leads to amnesia. And in fact, amnesia is a strategy that has actually been advocated by many people in the nuclear industry, that really you shouldn't call attention to this stuff. Or if you do call attention to it, you should just say, don't dig here. Of course, you realize that if you were a future archaeologist that saw a sign saying, don't dig here, that's exactly where you'd want to dig. And to think that future archaeologists aren't going to know that something is buried when they can see all the signs of an excavation is foolish. So it's certainly not true that we can fool long distance civilizations into thinking we didn't do anything. So after abandonment, there is no transparency, there is no education, no consultation, no alternatives, no remediation, because nobody's home. And we feel that this is really not right. This is at least premature. And that certainly for several generations to come, we should keep this waste under close surveillance. And we should be much better at packaging it very sturdily. And we should, in fact, take it away from the immediate waterfront where it's often now located, and move it a little further inland at least, and put it under very reinforced structures, which are very strong to resist airplane crashes and such things as that, and not take it for granted that these things are all going to disappear by magic and go underground, reappear underground. That's not going to happen. So is there an alternative to geological disposal? An alternative is needed for several reasons. First of all, moving the waste adds another waste site to those already existing. We've already got the waste sites at the reactor sites, but we're creating a new waste site for where the repository is going to be. Transportation poses new risks and complicates the picture. And centralized storage lays the groundwork possibly for reprocessing, which would, in fact, we are convinced, would make the radioactive waste problem more complicated, not significantly easier to manage, but rather more difficult to manage. So Rolling Stewardship is an alternative to abandonment. It's based on frankness. We begin by admitting that we have at present no proven solution. We have good ideas, but we don't know if those ideas are actually solutions. Deep geological disposal is a good idea, perhaps, but it's not a solution. Wastes are monitored and retrievable for the foreseeable future. They're packaged safely for extended periods and repackaged later. This is not a solution, but it's an ethical waste management scheme, and it's needed until a genuine solution is found. By a genuine solution, I mean, these wastes are only 80 years old. Before fission was discovered, these post-fission wastes we didn't know anything about. And so we have a very short history with these wastes. We also really don't understand them as well as we think we do. So we feel that that the production of additional waste can and should be stopped insofar as that is possible, and not necessarily overnight, but should be stopped. And only then can you really talk about a genuine solution to begin with. But a genuine solution, if we can use our imaginations, if we knew a way of safely putting this material into the heart of the sun, for example, that would definitely eliminate it. So there are ways in the cosmos of eliminating this waste, but not on Earth. And so we don't have a solution at the present time. It's possible that in 100 or 200 years, that science will advance to the point where we will actually know how to neutralize these things. I can't imagine what that would be, but who knows? I mean, we can't imagine most of the things that have happened in the 20th century with science. So rolling stewardship is persistence of memory as opposed to amnesia. And that persistence of memory fits in very well with the RKM project of the Nuclear Energy Agency that I talked about earlier. And it also means that we have to educate our own citizens as to what these wastes really are and stop running away from the problem, which is what the industry tries to do. They're embarrassed by this problem. They find it a liability and an embarrassment. And the reason they're not the best people to look after it is because when it comes to reactor safety, they have as much investment as anybody in keeping those reactors safe. So at least they're on their toes, trying to make it safe. But with regard to radioactive waste, they don't have that similar kind of long-term concern as an industry. Their concern is to try and satisfy the regulators and satisfy the public that they've done all they can so that they can walk away from it. And their ultimate objective, whether they admit it or not, is to be able to just walk away from it, whereupon they say, okay, it's your problem. So this is an intergenerational thing. And we think that it would have to be set up in such a way, and this is one of the drawbacks of rolling stewardship, is are we politically constituted to be able to do these things? Well, long-term stewardship is a point to remark, as Niels pointed out. Also, we do have 220 million tons of uranium tailings, and surely we do have to look after that for indefinitely into the future. The half-life is, I mean, the dangerous lifetime of those uranium tailings is approximately 800,000 years. So we feel that we have to actually have an institution which has expertise, but also has strong civic involvement and has people who are more knowledgeable in the biological and environmental sciences, even more so than in the nuclear sciences, although both are necessary. Because we really need to know how these things operate. For example, right now we're talking about a gigantic mound of radioactive waste in Chalk River, Ontario, called the Near Surface Disposal Facility. And very little attention is given to the mobility of the various radionuclides. For example, carbon-14, there's large quantities of carbon-14 in that mound, going into that mound. And carbon-14 is mobile. It can escape the mound as carbon dioxide, radioactive carbon dioxide. It can also form carbonic acid and create pathways through its weak acidity, which then can be a pathway for other radionuclides to follow in escaping from the mound. Then we have, of course, tritium, which comes off as water vapor, as well as liquid water emissions. And there's huge quantities of tritium in the mound. So, but very little consideration is given to this because all the emphasis placed on the engineering. If we get the engineering right, we don't have to worry about any of these radionuclides because none of them are going to escape. Well, that's not true. So now tell me, am I out of time or should I keep going a little bit? How's my time?
You have at least 6 minutes, but you can definitely go a bit more if you want.
Okay, fine. Okay, so I have 4 questions. How do we tell future generations about the radioactive legacy we're leaving them? And we have to begin with present generations. If we can make it understandable to present generations, we have a better chance of telling future generations. How do we safeguard plutonium from bomb makers and from profiteers for thousands of years? Now, this is, of course, a matter of great concern and a lot of debate. Putting the plutonium underground, it means that it itself becomes an attractive target for human intervention. The plutonium itself is a valuable commodity. People can dig down and excavate the waste in order to get the plutonium. And of course, the plutonium becomes more and more accessible as time goes on, as the more gamma emitting radionuclides diminish in quantity and in intensity. So that's a serious problem indeed. We feel that rolling stewardship, it's better to keep this stuff under monitoring and under surveillance by people who really are responsible individuals and that have the resources to really safeguard it. Because nobody can just waltz in there and take this material away and use it for bombs if we have it under our close, careful control. But I admit that that's a very serious problem. And whether we bury it or not, it's a very serious problem. How do we prepare for new unorthodox nuclear fuel waste in small modular nuclear reactors? Nobody is talking about that. Nobody is really talking about that in Canada. They're talking about building these reactors, and we have the same old philosophy we had in the past. We'll worry about the waste later. Well, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. Going forward, if we had a decent regulator, I'm sorry, I don't mean to offend the CNSC people who are present, but if we had a decent regulator, they would be insisting that the waste problem be addressed fully before the project is even approved. They should already have a detailed plan as to what this waste is going to entail and how it's going to be managed, how it's going to be packaged. Some of these wastes in small modular reactors are going to have very reactive materials, very corrosive materials like salt and sodium metal. How is that going to affect the repository? How is that going to add to the heat load of the repository? What about exothermic chemical reactions, et cetera, et cetera? None of this is being considered at the present time. How do we deal with all the long-lived radioactive waste from dismantling the old reactors? No discussion of this either. So I think this is irresponsible, quite irresponsible, particularly since back in the 70s, the message was delivered loud and clear. Until you can solve the waste problem, you shouldn't be building new reactors, period. So again, the lessons of the past are not being learned, and we're doomed to relive them, it seems. Telling future generations, of course, it has to do with this preservation of records, knowledge, and memory across generations. I think a wonderful phrase. And there were 21 organizations from 14 countries representing implementing agencies, regulators, policymakers, R&D institutions, and international and archiving agencies, plus the IAEA, contributed to the work for a period of about 8 or 9 years. Now, I just wanted to point out something else that is important, and that is this is a graph from the Royal Commission report that I mentioned to you, the Ontario Royal Commission report. It shows the toxicity of high-level waste over 10 million years. And by the way, after about 50,000 years, the toxicity goes back up again. That's because of the inbreeding of other radioactive materials as decay products, including radium and, as you probably know, plutonium-239. When it disintegrates, it has a 24,000-year half-life, and it's of course immediately weapons usable. But when it disintegrates, plutonium-239 disintegrates into uranium-235. So you have uranium-235 has a 700 million year half-life, and uranium-235 is also immediately weapons usable. So if all the plutonium in the waste repository totally disintegrated, you would have 100% pure uranium-235 in its place. I'm getting some kind of feedback. Is that from me?
I just muted.
Okay. Now I'm almost finished. I just wanted to mention a couple of other things, and that is that one of the arguments in favor of reprocessing, that is removing the plutonium from the spent fuel before burying, which is something that is again being talked about a great deal. The closer we get to burying the waste, the more intense is going to be the discussion about whether to reprocess the waste or not to extract the plutonium. And the danger of this is that inadvertently, the very design of a DGR might lead to extensive reprocessing around the world, and therefore tremendous proliferation of nuclear weapons. Because reprocessing and extracting the plutonium would be a great idea if you knew how to get rid of it, but you don't know how to get rid of it. And the result is what you're doing is you're making it much easier for bomb makers and terrorists and criminals to get their hands on the plutonium. So you may be thinking that you're doing the world a favor, and you're doing exactly the opposite. So this is a really serious problem. But one of the arguments used in favor of reprocessing is that, well, isn't it the plutonium and the transuranics that create the greatest risk long-term to escape of radionuclides from the repository? And the answer is no, not really, because if you look at the long-lived fission products like selenium-79, technetium-99. These products are fission products, but they have half-lives of hundreds of thousands, even millions of years. And they are much more mobile from an underground repository than plutonium and the transuranics. Plutonium and the transuranics might be able to get out, and they would cause a lot of havoc if they did, but these things are a lot more mobile and they can get out a lot easier. And in fact, they dominate the long-term risk more so than the transuranics. So I think the argument about removing plutonium as a way of diminishing the long-term risk is questionable. Also, when we talk about dismantling old nuclear reactors, just here's some numbers here. Radiation fields from reactor components. This is from Ontario Power Generation, a document called the Preliminary Nuclear Decommissioning Cost Study, okay? And a pressure tube, you know, we have hundreds of pressure tubes in the core of our reactors. One pressure tube would give 850 rems per hour at contact, which would be death in 28 minutes, a lethal dose in 28 minutes. The thermal shield would give death in 5.5 seconds, 260,000 rems per hour. The calandria shell, which is the vessel itself, 49,000 rems per hour. That's death in 29 seconds. Dump tank. The dump tank is where they dump the heavy water moderator if it gets, you know, as a way of shutdown. Death in 2 minutes, 12,000 rems per hour. These things are people in Canada don't even know about these things. And when the CNSC or the nuclear industry talks about intermediate level waste, they make it sound trivial. They talk about mop heads and rags and contaminated clothing. They don't mention these things, nor do they mention the whole concept of activation, the whole concept that a neutron hitting a previously non-radioactive material can transform it into a radioactive material. And that's what happens in these structural materials. You get not just contamination, but actual transmutation and buildup of all these. Here are some activation products with long half-lives. I put the 10 half-lives there because that's what you need to go from a terabecquerel to a gigabecquerel, you know, it's 10 half-lives. That's how long it takes to go from a terabecquerel to a gigabecquerel, and then another 10 half-lives to go from a gigabecquerel to a megabecquerel, and so on. So it's a factor of 1,000 drop, basically, in 10 half-lives. So look at those things, and those things are all in the decommissioning waste. So these are very long-term wastes as well. Now, they may not be as radioactive, and they are not as radioactive as the spent fuel, but in the long run, they may end up being more mobile in the environment, especially if they're in Canada. They're now talking about burying defunct nuclear reactors right beside major rivers, right where they were built in the first place to get the cooling water from the river. The NPD reactor, they want to bury it right on site and just use grout to keep it safe for the next million years. Well, I'm sorry, but that's irresponsible. And in fact, the IAEA specifically warns against it. And yet our complacent regulator and our complacent government and our eager industry is quite happy to do this because it solves their problem quickly. And they say, well, burying it on site, this in situ decommissioning is a way of reducing the worker exposure, but they don't talk about future generations. Are you saying the workers should be protected, but future generations should not? So I think that's about all I would like to say. I wanted to make a final statement that I think for at least until we have a better grasp of what a solution might really be, and until we really know what we're going to do with regard to the plutonium question, and until we really know what is really acceptable to society when they are fully informed, which they are not, then we should use rolling stewardship. We should use rolling stewardship not as a solution, but as an ethical and scientifically sound waste management scheme that we know can be made to work if we put the resources and the money and the expertise into it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Is there you went back to a new part of your presentation there? No.
Well, to tell you the truth, we have right now, April 2nd is the deadline for public comments on Canada's new enhanced radioactive waste policy, which completely maintains the status quo in terms of having everybody go through the one agency that promotes nuclear power, which is Natural Resources Canada. We have been trying very hard to get some independence in there. We've been trying to get the CNSC to report to an independent minister and to separate itself more from the industry. One of the problems with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's policy, and they have a policy of I forget the right name, non-directive regulation. What that means is that they don't, non-prescriptive, that's the word, non-prescriptive. What that means is they don't prescribe anything. They don't tell the industry what to do or what they can do or what they cannot do. They let the industry come up with the proposal, and then they simply judge whether the safety plan is okay, that they can rubber stamp it. So they can't even tell the industry, for example, it's out of their philosophy for the CNSC to tell the industry, oh, you can't put those wastes right beside a river. You have to look for a site further away from the river, because that river goes down to the St. Lawrence River, and there's 20 million people drawing their drinking water from that river. This is less than 1 kilometer from a river, and all it is a glorified landfill, 5 to 7 stories high, with covering about 14 hectares of land, containing about 1 million cubic meters of radioactive waste. So what the philosophy of the CNSC is, we're basically just the coach. The industry tells us what they want to do, and we sort of give them guidance as to how best to do it and how best to make their safety plan acceptable to the commissioners.
Thank you very much, Gordon, for this very comprehensive presentation.